Iran has agreed to let the UN's nuclear watchdog inspect 2 sites where it's suspected that secret atomic activity may have been going on. The deal was struck in Tehran after talks between the 2 sides at the highest level, ending months of dispute. In a joint statement released by Tehran and the International Atomic Energy Agency, both parties agreed to inspect 2 unnamed sites located west of Tehran and central Iran. In March, the IAEA denied inspectors access to 2 sites where explosive testing are suspected of having been carried out in the early 2000s. The agreement comes as the United States, despite having pulled out of the world powers' deal with Iran in 2018, is seeking to use a mechanism available to parties to trigger the reimposition of global UN sanctions against Tehran that were lifted under the 2015 accord. Well, to help us unpack this latest agreement between the nuclear watchdog and Iran, we are now joined by Prof Seyed Marandi, who's an Iranian academic, a political analyst, and an expert on American studies and post-colonial literature. And he joins us from Tehran via Skype. Prof, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program. Always good to have your views on what's happening in your country. So why has it taken so long for Tehran to agree to these inspections if they had nothing to hide?
Well, the Iranians negotiated with the International Atomic Energy Agency to make sure that they don't use this as an excuse to just continuously carry out inspections everywhere and anywhere at the behest of the Americans and the Israelis. Remember that this whole confrontation that began between the IAEA and Iran was simultaneous with American attempts to reimpose the military embargo on Iran, or to extend the military embargo on Iran, which failed at the UN Security Council. And then subsequently, the Americans tried to use the snapback mechanism to wreck the nuclear deal. And again, they failed at the UN Security Council because member states said that the Americans had left the agreement and therefore they had no right to use the mechanism. So when the Americans, however, when the Americans began this new escalation a few months ago, the IAEA simultaneously began an escalation with Iran under its new chief. And the new chief was the person that the Americans wanted in place. So the Iranians believed that this was politicized. And so they negotiated with the IAEA and stonewalled until they got what they wanted. So basically what they're going to do is they're going to allow these 2 sites to be inspected, but that will be the end of the story. And the IAEA has accepted that. So they can't say that after we visit these 2 sites, now we want to go and visit other sites, because the Iranians believe that this will be a never-ending process. So if the IAEA finds nothing there, it will show that the Iranians were right all along and that the Americans and the Israeli regime are simply looking for trouble.
Is there a problem with ongoing inspections? I mean, you know, if Tehran has not been pursuing the weaponizing of nuclear science, then it doesn't matter how many inspections you get because there's nothing to hide again.
Well, the Americans have been using the IAEA to carry out espionage on Iran on sites that have nothing to do with the nuclear program. So the Americans, for example, want to figure out what sort of military conventional weapons Iran has, what sort of equipment they have in different bases, so they automatically ask the IAEA to check those sites because there are suspicious activities going on there, and then these inspectors come in. And many of the inspectors are affiliated to European countries and to NATO countries, so there have been many complications. We have to remember that the overwhelming majority of all of the inspections that are taking place across the world by the IAEA are carried out in Iran. So Iran is allowing inspectors to constantly move around in the country, constantly inspect sites in accordance with the nuclear agreement. And remember, this is the nuclear agreement that the Europeans are violating and the Americans have torn. So the Iranians, despite the violations of the Europeans and the Americans, they continue to abide by large segments of the agreement which have to do with the IAEA and their ability to inspect sites. So they have a great deal of access, more access than in any other country. Their inspections are more than in any other country. But I think the Iranians would be very naive to believe that this international body is void or an exception to the rule with regards to US pressure and influence.
So what safeguards then has Tehran been given in this round of inspections to ensure the confidentiality of some of the things that they may see that, as you're saying, could be of concern in terms of national security?
Well, what the Iranians did finally, after months of negotiating, is they said, okay, these two sites are really important. Fine, we will allow you to inspect them because you have all these alleged suspicions, but then that's the end of the story. If you don't find anything, you cannot continue pursuing this case. And the IAEA accepted because obviously it's very logical. They pinpointed these two sites. They've been speaking about them for months. They've been putting pressure on Iran. And so now the Iranians are saying, okay, fine, but then if we allow you in, then you're not going to go and ask for any other new sites to visit with regards to this particular case. And the IAEA was sort of put in a very difficult position, and they accepted. And remember, this deal came right after the Americans were defeated or humiliated, however one would like to interpret it, in the UN Security Council, when they were completely isolated and the UN Security Council refused to accept the American interpretation that they have a right to use the snapback mechanism with regards to Iran's nuclear program and the nuclear deal. So after this victory, Iran was in a more confident position, and therefore they gave the IAEA this access under those conditions.
Has Iran ever developed nuclear weapons?
Well, there is a very good book, which is a bit old now, by Gareth Porter, Manufactured Crisis, where he goes through the history of the Iranian nuclear program, and he points out quite specifically and explicitly and in detail that the Iranians never actively pursued a nuclear weapon. However, the Iranians have been trying to utilize the non-proliferation treaties scope of rights that exist for all sovereign nations. Iran has tried to use it to the maximum to be able to set up a comprehensive peaceful nuclear program. And this is something that the Iranians have been doing in all fields of high-tech technologies. For example, Iran, if your viewers do some research, they'll see that Iran is a leading country with regards to nanotechnology. Or Iran sends satellites into orbit. It builds satellites which are sent into orbit. And also the Iranians have a very advanced military defense industry. So Iran is, or also stem cell research in Iran is quite developed. So the new technologies, artificial intelligence, these are all fields of inquiry which are being pursued in Iran. And nuclear technology is one of those fields, especially since much of the infrastructure that was created in Iran, ironically, during the Shah's rule, where the country really wasn't being developed properly, but one area in which the Shah invested a huge amount of money in was the nuclear industry. And so much of this infrastructure was half built, and the Iranian government says that we have spent a lot of money and we have to build this infrastructure and complete this infrastructure. So much of the initial infrastructure was actually built by Western countries. So no, there is no evidence whatsoever that Iran ever actively pursued a nuclear weapon. But like everything else, the United States accuses Iran of building nuclear weapons, of terrorism, everything that you can, human rights violations. Iran is, according to the American narrative, we are the most evil place on this earth, and the only thing left to accuse us of is global warming, I suppose.
All right, so then why were these two sites in particular identified as areas of concern? What brought rise to that?
Well, the Israeli regime claimed to have been able to gain access to a large amount of intelligence on Iran's nuclear activities, and they claimed that the Iranians are carrying out suspicious activities in these sites. And the Iranians have been saying all along that the Israeli regime has a history of manufacturing intelligence on Iran, and therefore we are not going to give access to the International Atomic Energy Agency based upon Israeli accusations. That is not legitimate. And of course, especially coming from the Israeli regime, which has, by some estimates, up to 200 nuclear warheads as we speak. But in any case, the Iranians have put the IAEA in a bit of a tight spot now, because they're saying, okay, what if we do give you this access, then no more complaints? And apparently, I mean, very specifically, the IAEA put that into writing, and they accepted that.
Is there an argument that if some countries in the world are allowed to have nuclear arsenals, then Iran must be allowed to develop nuclear weapons if it so wishes?
Well, that is an argument that some people in Iran do make. But the point is that Iran has rights within the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Iran is a member of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And so far, after all these years and all the accusations, no evidence has ever been produced to show that Iran was ever actively pursuing a nuclear weapon. And Iranian senior officials have said repeatedly that if Iran was seriously seeking a nuclear weapon, they would have had it by now. Iran definitely has the technological capability and the resources to be able to pursue and produce nuclear weapons if they wish to do so. But no evidence has ever been provided, and obviously, contrary to what the United States would like to have us believe, all countries are innocent unless proven otherwise. But in the case of Western hegemonic powers, it's usually the opposite when it comes to Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, Libya, or anywhere else on the planet that not concede to American demands.
All right, and perhaps finally, then, where does this leave the United States? They seem to be licking their wounds just the other day from the UN Security Council's rebuttal, and now this agreement for inspection with the IAEA. Where does that leave the US? Even more isolated, one would imagine.
Yes, but we don't expect the United States to learn any lessons. The United States has a very hostile and deep-seated hatred towards Iran that goes back from the days of the revolution when the pro-American Shah was overthrown. The Americans have never forgiven Iran since then. They tried to overthrow the Islamic Republic of Iran on many occasions. They helped Saddam Hussein wage a war against the country. They gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons to use extensively and repeatedly against the country, and they gave him the intelligence so that he could use those weapons, and they also gave him political cover. And since then, it's been sanctions and pressure, and also Western support for ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria. And just recently, just a few days ago, in Yemen, the Yemeni government, the Ansarullah, which is fighting the Saudis, they succeeded in defeating ISIS in Yemen. And during this major battle that was being carried out, the Saudi Air Force was constantly bombing the Yemeni government so that to block them from defeating ISIS. So these are American allies in this region. These are American policies in this region. And I think it's quite clear from what we are seeing and what we've been seeing in the past, no matter what sort of humiliation the United States faces, there's no reason to believe that the Americans are going to behave more reasonably in the future.
And that's where we'll leave it. Thanks very much indeed, Professor Seyed Marandi, for your insights. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
All right, that's expert on, well, political commentator, and particularly US and Iran politics, speaking to us about this agreement that IAEA has signed with Tehran around inspections of sites in the country.